Everyone, happy Wednesday afternoon. If you're joining us live, welcome back to Manufacturing Hub. We've got a super fun guest, Amos, on this week who we'll go talk about. We have, in fact, Vlad and I have been reminiscing on some of our early guests that we have not had the opportunity to go get back on. Amos has been a whole 233 episodes in between the first time we had him on and this now the second time we had him on. So we're happy to go ahead and have an update and have a conversation. Go talk about some general manufacturing things, some state of manufacturing, some fun notes of what's to come. Next week, Vlad and I in Manufacturing Hub are going to jump into a technology modernization theme. We're going to go try to have the conversation of, hey, we talk about all of these big buzzwords that sometimes Vlad likes to go rattle off. Sometimes I, Dave, like to go rattle off, just in a big, long list. But we talk about them. They're not necessarily the easiest to go take those thoughts and conversations and go actually modernize our plants and facilities. So we're going to go through and hopefully walk a path of how we take some of that executive vision and transform that into technology modernization for your facilities. Beyond that, and I think it's going to work really well, we've got Prove It coming up in the second week of February in Dallas, Texas. So if you guys are Prove It fans, or if you're not Prove It fans, follow along. We should have 3 separate conversations at minimum live coming from the Prove It podcast booth, which should be a lot of fun. Prove It's getting bigger. Our manufacturing hub, what we're doing here is getting bigger, and we're very excited to have everyone along the way. If you guys are new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you are new here, every week, Vlad and myself go and have some awesome conversations talking all about manufacturing. We're excited to have you along. If you guys are in chat, say hi, let us know where you're watching from. If you've got questions for Amos when we introduce him, or Vlad or myself, please feel free to go ahead and drop those in chat, and we'll do our very best to get to them during the show. Having said that, and without further ado, everyone, officially welcome to Manufacturing Hub. This is episode 242. My name is Dave Griffith. This guy up here is Vlad Romanov. We'd like to welcome Amos back onto the show. Amos, thank you for joining us once again. Welcome back.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back, Dave and Vlad. Definitely, it's been a few episodes for sure, but I know you guys have covered a lot of good topics since then. So it is my pleasure to be back.
Thank you so much for joining us, Amos. I think it's going to be a really good and interesting conversation. Before we do that, though, could you please reintroduce yourself, give us a bit of an overview of your background, what you're doing, I guess, career-wise, and ultimately what you are up to these days?
Yeah. So I'm Amos Purdy. I have a master's in business administration and also electrical engineering with 15 plus years in the industrial space, as well as 20 plus years in just programming, honestly, in general. Really started way back before I was even in college. I was doing freelance web design and really getting into, around the .com bubble, a lot of the web technologies. So once I went to my college, I focused on, computer engineering. So really, to tell you the truth, saw a ton of what I would say the original edge devices, the IoT devices, and worked with an oil and gas company to even see, really remote IoT kind of devices and see all that kind of stuff. So I really got interested in, a lot of what industry has and how they interact with the real world clear back when I was in college. When I was in my master's in electrical engineering, I actually made the first industrial automation class for them. Worked with the oil and gas company to design the lab, control motors, valves, sensors, all that kind of stuff, and eventually have the students actually drive a robot through a maze using a Slick 505. So that was a fun thing all those years back. But after doing a lot of that, being around the industry, seeing a lot of different people, really wanted to go to my MBA because, to understand how all of this data, because I feel like industrial was definitely some of the best and most data generated out there. I mean, you can talk about web stuff, and what people generate, but industry just generates so much data. And so I went to my MBA to try to figure out, okay, how does this integrate with the business? How does it drive sales? How does it drive marketing? How does it drive, the C-level decisions? So it was definitely worthwhile going to that to understand, what all of this stuff really meant for, in the early 2000s, what all this stuff was really going to mean. So, yeah, once I got out, I worked with an OEM for medical devices. And I also worked with like a glass manufacturer, started their MES, started as a controls engineer to really start going after some different nagging problems when we were at the glass plant. And what we found out was we needed more data. So I did a ton of stuff around, integrating, automotive. At that point, there was still stuff from the late 80s, in there, and figuring out how to actually get all of those old pieces of equipment, newer and older, working with contractors that had, machines for a service, machines as a service kind of thing that they would go and do, and how to integrate all that stuff to really start to drive some decisions across the plant. So, it was great coming right out of, early college, seeing all the data that was generated across a lot of these industries, going to the MBA, seeing what that meant for a lot of the different companies to drive decisions, want transparency, want to see more and more, and eventually started the MES department, and then we ended up, contracting or working with the other sites to also help them build an MES department, or at least get data out. And that was just for this specific glass plant or glass company, which was awesome to see that, just the automotive piece, how old some of those technologies can be and how ingrained a lot of that stuff could be. But knowing, having all of that background around down to the, the logics, the FPGAs, even custom boards, how to get that data out and start to drive business decisions. So that was really interesting. So right after that, I went and worked for GPA. They're a consulting firm across a lot of different industries: pulp and paper, agricultural products, food and bev, and to get to talk to a lot of different industries, and really what we were focusing on was manufacturing intelligence, getting the data out, getting better data from the different operators across a lot of different settings, and really trying to get more data transparency, maybe early industrial 4.0 and that kind of stuff. That's when I first got introduced to Ignition. Ignition's been a great Swiss Army knife in that regard of getting stuff out, integrating with very old or edge devices, and so with a lot of that kind of stuff, really got to work really closely with the C-levels or their upper engineers to say, what data do I need to get? How do I get it better? And how do I drive it directly to reports, usually, just for the, straight to the C-level? Because a lot of those different devices or different places, they just never had any visibility, or they were doing something new that they didn't know how. And for them to see that data being generated, coming in, being, sometimes, they used to spend 2-3 weeks trying to gather data, but then seeing it like real time was awesome. So working with GPA was definitely interesting, just to see how much data really, very specific data, how much that can completely change a business on how they operate and how they really go about with their decisions. So, and then after GPA, I went over to Proterra. They're a battery manufacturer, or at least they're a battery manufacturer now around EV batteries. We originally were making buses, so it was interesting seeing, the automotive side, but as well as, the automotive being driven by batteries. And there's just been a ton of investment and growth in around the EVs and battery business that, there's so much there that's going on. There's competition throughout the world. I mean, there's, stuff just down the road from us, but there was, a ton of development going on in Europe, China, and, just to see how broad of a investment across the whole globe, EVs were, and battery technology was really awesome to see. And while I was there, I, originally just showed up as an analyst and programmer for the MES, but eventually took over the MES and SCADA for operations. So really, I got to see every bit of the process, every bit of the process from individual sensors, devices, PLCs, all the way up to what we're reporting, how we're driving forecasts, how we're driving inventory, how we're, how we're driving to the customer demand versus, which was constantly shifting, how we were, how we were changing production constantly to try to meet with demand and, with changing forecasts and everything. So it was, really interesting, especially when it comes down to slight differences on how you can manufacture one part for one customer versus the next, and how you keep ahead of that, because one customer might take a lot longer for one part to make, but you need to fit it in between all the ones that are not as much, but you still need to get them out. So yeah, the EV industry is very interesting. So
let me ask you a follow-up question on that side, right? And we have a ton of different questions for you for this episode, Amos, but I'm curious, again, re-listening to your background, right? So having switched between so many what I would describe very different industries from a process standpoint, and for sure from a business challenge standpoint, I'm curious for as far as automation and MES data goes, because again, when you talk to sometimes recruiters that come from those different industries, they want someone specifically from food and bev for their food and bev facility. How much of a barrier was it for you? And I guess the follow-up question is, how would you tell engineers seeking to maybe change verticals at this point in time, and how easy is it to make that jump from, again, an automation and maybe data standpoints?
Yeah, I mean, every industry is obviously a little bit different. There's a lot of industries are very discrete versus like batch processing, which is a completely different type of process, and especially from a data gathering, how you generate KPIs, and how you even really, forecast a lot of the consumption and everything. So, there's definitely different parts of that. OE is probably a lot easier on the, discrete kind of process, but you can do it on batch processes. A lot of batch processes, there's other little pieces. So I would say, when you're getting into one industry, you're probably going to see, I mean, even if it's generally discrete, you're still going to see a little bit of batch here and there. Maybe it's a dispenser, a mixer or something, or a cleaner. So you're going to see some of those different things. And I would say, the processes might be different, but there are a lot of the same kind of components. So, depending on if you want to be at the, heavy device instrumentation or like controls layer where you're touching devices, you're going to see a lot of these devices. The biggest thing from one industry to the next is probably brand names. So you might not know the buzzwords, the TLAs, and the brands and that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't think that should be a barrier, but it is something that, there's a lot of people that might be a little bit older that always will only use one brand, right?
Yeah.
So that is one thing. Like, if you're going to try to jump industries, you probably need to understand some of the different brands around that kind of thing. Some long-term kind of, what people processes that people generally deploy, because that's usually what you'll see, and that's what they'll want. Life sciences is one that I would say the other big hurdle is just understanding what it takes to deploy and validate a lot of those processes. Life science can be several years out in validation, whereas, food and bev, it might be, a couple of weeks to know that this small changes is fine, let's go. Or, sometimes automotive can be the sooner the better. We'll figure it out in the end. So, just the speed of being able to deploy and be able to, come back, and what it means for validation and testing of those things. I think it's really important. And especially if you come from web technologies, it's a completely different world. You don't get A/B testing a lot of the time. So it better work, or else you're cleaning up stuff for days. So yeah, validation.
As a follow-up, Amos, and maybe speaking of web technologies, right? And you've already mentioned Ignition as a big platform that you've worked with, especially at the SCADA and MES layers. I'm curious, having to work with the platform, but also having to hire engineers to work on the platform, but also having made the transition, right, as you've described, from more controls-based role into like SCADA and MES, that I think not only many engineers would sometimes want to do from the OT side, but also nowadays, because of the layoffs from the software industry, maybe are looking to get into automation at those layers. I'm curious what your experience has been hiring engineers at that layer, mentoring engineers at that layer? What kind of maybe background does it take? Is it a web background versus plant floor exposure? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that side.
Yeah. So like people going from web technologies down to more of an industrial kind of engineer. I mean, I do like hiring those people knowing that, if they know that, what that actually means, right? So web technologies can be really flashy and, cutting edge. And there's a lot of different, you know, Git branch and all this kind of stuff where those technologies might not, translate down. But what it actually, what industrial stuff really does give you, though, is that ability to use some of those technologies, and really kind of hammer on them, right? So I think it's important to when you're looking at someone who has web technologies, like them understanding networking and
Hmm.
data quality, data reliability, and understanding that the safety is that much more important, more of a focus, and the stability, right? Like you don't want to be cutting edge because you'll probably be bleeding edge at that point, and coming back from a lot of stuff. So you want to have a lot more of that kind of testing and validation, which in web technologies you might have a tool to do that. You just go and install it and off you go. You're not going to have that. You're going to have to know how to go test and validate your own systems. And I think that drive to want to do that, make systems that are stable, maintainable, fixable, and supportable, is completely different than I want to create something really cool and we'll see how it lands kind of thing. So it's a little bit of a mindset change for sure.
Let me throw one last question before I pass it on to Dave. But on that train of thought of creating something cool, especially I would say with the advancements in AI, right? A lot of engineers in our space are asking the question of how much time should I upskill on existing technologies, and again that could be your PLCs, HMIs, SCADAs, right, all the way to MES, versus learning about this quote unquote emerging solution that might result in higher performance, right? And there's a lot of talks, and let's say on the ignition side, to generate screens a lot faster. So there's this very difficult, how would I say, like balance between, hey, should we invest the time to learn how to do it the way it's always been done? Because again, our industry moves relatively slow, versus should we spend the time trying to, upskill on AI, and maybe it is the future. I'm curious to hear your thoughts when it comes to, again, like working with engineers trying to learn some of these newer things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to always, keep an eye on newer technologies, and I think AI can be used in very good ways. But you're still going to have to go back and check that stuff. So
Hmm.
learn how to use it to augment things. But really, I would say you got to know the basics, and depending on your industry, and if you're trying to break into a certain industry or you're in an industry, look at how fast or how flashy some of those things can be. A lot of those things already have standards around them where you're not going to need. They don't necessarily want AI to even crawl it to help you out, right?
Hmm.
Or even if you do something, it's still going to be years out. So you're still going to need to know a lot of these things, be able to check, validate, test those, make them stable. So know the old technology, even if it's 5 years, because 5 years, there's going to be stuff that's out there for decades, right? As you see, we still got stuff out there from the 2000s, 90s, and possibly even 80s, right? They're going to be out there
Yep.
for decades. It's going to help you to know all of those things, and especially when you come to that, the newer technologies and that kind of stuff. A lot of people are going to know how to use those. Maybe younger people coming out, like they know how to use some of those technologies. How to do those older technologies. That's always going to be a skill that help you overcome a lot of hurdles throughout your
Hmm.
industrial career for sure.
I like that.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate it, Amos. I guess I want to ask you a couple more questions on growing and building teams. So I know over the last couple of positions that you've had, you've got to grow and build the teams to some large extent yourself, finding and training and upskilling and doing all of those other fun doing all of those other fun managerial style solutions. And I also know that you've done a lot of work, and your teams have done a lot of work on the ignition platforms. A conversation we have all of the time is talking about different backgrounds. And I know you talked a little bit about different backgrounds, and I know you talked about specifically web developers. When you're looking for someone to come into the team, and the team is we're building ignition solutions in this instance, are there any particular backgrounds that you're looking for? Are there different skills or potential hobbies or other things that generally for you are like, this is going to probably be a good fit? Let's go continue this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're building on ignition, obviously you'd love to have them have ignition background, or so they can hit the ground running. But I would say, a lot of ignition, and especially around perspective, has a lot of those web technologies. So understanding some of those and having some, at least some background around that, knowing all the technologies around it, you can probably help them learn around some of those other things, developing screens and that kind of stuff. But, really, I would say, it depends, right? You got to look at your business, you got to look at your team. And really, usually when, you're looking at training people, I like to give them things they want to do, right? So you have to know your team and what they want to do. As manager and lead, a lot of times, I could backfill a lot of those things they didn't really want to do. If they didn't want to do networking, or they didn't want to do a lot of the logging or alarming and stuff, you can backfill. But finding things that they want to grow in and getting them excited about the platform, the problems that they're solving, how they're going about them, the processes, and and having them talk to people that are using the systems. I find that's the best. I mean, it tell you the truth, it really starts with hiring. You can get given people, but when you're hiring, you got to figure out what skill gaps you're going to be filling. How they're going to benefit the team. Are they going to drive productivity? Are they going to into new technologies, or are they going to back up and expand your bench around certain things that are heavily invested and are going to only expand? But really, what is their passion and where are they going to fit in the team? Like, knowing that from the beginning when you're hiring is so important. And it makes supporting them, training them, and upskilling them so much easier when they're dedicated and they're interested in what you need them to do for the business. And it's so much easier.
Absolutely. Let me go ask that on the flip side. So for people who are perhaps looking to go get a job or to go change jobs and have ignition experience, or looking to get into ignition development, you, from the perspective of a hiring manager, what are things people could do to go set themselves apart as they're looking for jobs? Is it go through inductive university? Is it go build some home solutions themselves? What for you, what would set a candidate apart from other candidates?
To tell you the truth, I love hobbyists. Finding reasons, finding problems at home, finding reasons and ways to fix them, and then going after and deploying it. Like, I mean, it's kind of everything that you need them to do on job. And especially as easy as ignition can make it. And there's a lot of, cheap solutions out there, like, controlling your water pump, or turning on a light, or running solar, like monitoring how often you open a cabinet, one of the guys said. So, like those little things, like identifying the problem, coming up with the solution, coming up with the process, coming up with the whole system, doing some system engineering and bringing that in. I mean, they're gonna encounter a lot of those things, maybe not do it completely right, but they at least know where it starts to, they had questions, or it could be changed and stuff when they come in. And especially because, systems engineering, solution architecting, controls engineering, a lot of that is a lot of the same. It might be slightly different technologies, but it's understanding the whole process and understanding what it takes to really solve it. So I definitely look for hobbyists for sure.
I really like that answer. If I may jump in for just a brief comment, right? And we spoke to David Gusenmeyer, who's the lead of the Inductives education program, and they're putting out so many, not only materials, but also reaching out to so many schools that it's almost, I guess the best word I can find is disappointing when it's just a cert, right? I would want to see them try and apply their knowledge to some kind of an interesting process. And as you said, in software, you can pretty much do anything, right? So obviously, you can interface with a physical system, but at the end of the day, you can simulate quite a bit. And it's always a lot more interesting to talk about those applications, I find, than, hey, I sat down and I've gone through the educational materials, which is good, right? Which is, I think,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
good starting point, but ultimately, like, interesting projects, I think, spawn a lot of creative ideas and conversations in interviews as well.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that, Amos. So we could certainly talk about this for the entire 7 hours of conversation. I do want to go transition a little bit and get your thoughts on some of the technology modernization. So we're going to go talk about it all for the next 4 weeks on Manufacturing Hub. But you have, within the last, I don't know, 5 or so years, have worked for some very old legacy manufacturers who are looking to go through this modernization, and you've worked for cutting edge, brand new organizations setting up first lines or first facilities, and I guess a little bit of everything in between. So I guess from your perspective, if you were looking at some of this technology modernization, do you think legacy manufacturers have the opportunity to go ahead and get to Industry 4.0, get to Industry 5.0, solve some of these solutions? Are there particular things that you would look or suggest that these groups kind of focus on in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, legacy manufacturers, your name means so much in an industry. So, to already overcome that hurdle is huge. And I think it's worth investing, especially if you've got the name, in updating your platforms and your integrations. It might be, additional recertification and stuff, but I think it's, better to start now than to be 5 years behind and have 2 years to recertify your hardware when you're obsolete and you just can't deploy it. But I mean, I think that the biggest thing for a lot of those legacy stuff, I mean, it's data availability, data transparency, and I think one of the biggest things is just cybersecurity. I'd say most things you have to get ready for, being connected to the internet. You hope it's behind a DMZ, but there's also internal threats on the plant floor, someone bringing in a USB and that kind of stuff. Like, cybersecurity is, and I've seen it take down plants, for days, and that's, a lot of money lost. And to try to come back and redo it, or take down a whole system and then, rebuild it and stuff is one of the biggest concerns. And with that cybersecurity and then the data transparency, I mean, everybody wants to see what's going on with their machines. They want to start integrating it with other things. They want to integrate it with AI agents or, other decision-making systems. So by just, making those a little bit easier to integrate, MQTT, or, just an API, or just some basic stuff that's, really isn't that hard to kind of tack on, well, depending on the system, but knowing that is something that is just going to become a standard as Industry 4.0, and a lot of these different systems really expand. And maybe one day we'll have AI in there. They'll need to be able to see every little bit of that. So yeah, definitely get ready to upgrade some of those communication protocols, for sure, to say the least.
As a follow-up to Dave's question, right, and maybe to take a step back on the general, to get maybe a general pulse on the industry from your side, Amos, right? I feel that sometimes, depending on which vertical the listeners or the audience is from, obviously they might have a different viewpoint of the readiness of their equipment, right? Some are obviously trying to deploy cutting edge solutions, and I think there's a lot of publications from, again, the automotive industry, like Tesla is going to basically communicate how they have everything state of the art, but a lot of other verticals are still quite far behind. So maybe, what is your perspective on the current state of, that state, but also maybe like appetite for data? Are you sold on the idea that everyone is trying to deploy these data solutions? Are there a lot of maybe or potentially some customers that you talk to who are just like stuck in their ways and we're fine doing it pen and paper? Like, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on maybe the overall manufacturing industry from your perspective.
Well, I would say, that's largely being driven by the C-level, and, the C-level might want critical data. So, if it's really old technology, it might just be a better way to get it out, and that's someone's very specific project. But it's those specific points that are driving the business, that they're going to invest in. Now, when you're building a new plant, you want to see everything. You want to try to, use AI, very data forward kind of organizations. Yeah, they might want all of that, readily available, newer technology, that kind of stuff. I would say, like you said, there's just certain industries that are willing to do that. Either they're younger or they have more investment in them. So not every industry is able to do that. But with that being said, what's really going to drive like old legacy ones to upgrade is really finding those very key spots in the process that they needed to monitor. There's some things that they're just never worried about that pump going down. Whatever, it's worked for the last 30 years. They've got to switch to another pump, and then, why spend the money to redo that, when there is no cost benefit? So, you got to think of it from the C-level. Is there a good cost benefit to really upgrade? A lot of these there isn't. And, if there's no driver, critical KPIs or anything off of it, there's just no drive to do it. There's no benefit. So I think we'll always see some, stuff from the 80s, to be honest.
And if I can jump into to that point, Amos, I feel like one of those cost benefit drivers, especially when it comes to the executives who would approve these projects, are if it hasn't broken and we haven't felt the pain recently, we're not even going to consider it. So it's not even just that the pump may go take us down and it may cause $5 million of critical downtime. It's that the pump hasn't gone down in the entirety of the time that the C-level executives have been there, and they haven't felt the pain of not having a critical spare or not going through to be able to monitor it. And if we haven't felt the pain, we probably feel the pain of 3 or 4 or 5,000 other things every week that has a higher level of attention than, hey, we've identified this potential major issue.
No, I definitely agree. I mean, I've seen it more recently in everything where controls engineers are actually trying to figure out what's the likelihood of their stuff going down and what that would mean. It might not be that often that goes down, but it might be we have to replace a pump, and it means we have to take outside of the building to put this pump back in because it doesn't go through the front door, kind of thing. And I've seen that where it's like it was a month and a half taking a whole plant down. And just because a simple replacement wasn't simple, but it was technology that had been there 25 years. But I would say that's where it really comes down to the engineer to start helping identify those things that, hey, this thing is running on Windows 7, right? Like this is a serious concern. We shouldn't be putting it out on the floor by a heater,
Yep.
But and bringing those up and focusing, because like you said, the C-level doesn't know that that's going to be a huge hit until it's a huge hit. And if it hasn't gone down in 20 years, of course they haven't seen that. But as the engineer, you're going to know that, and I constantly have to go out there and reset this, or we just saved that last batch just barely. Like those need to be stuff that you bring up to kind of force the topic or the discussion around what's critical and how bad it could be if it really goes down.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, right? Because it is a part of our industry that is extremely difficult to automate, right? If you have a machine that goes down, obviously you can tie in some kind of a data point where you could see, well, for the last period, a month or a quarter or a year, it has caused us X amount of dollars in downtime. But if you're talking about a risk assessment, if something were to fail, right, which hasn't failed in years or doesn't have any data coming from it, then you really need to rely on the expertise and obviously some general assessments to make that call in order to facilitate the investment of capital that would resolve that issue. But it is a very challenging, I would say, skill heavy type of an activity that you cannot just kind of do without having spent some amount of years within that facility and within the industry. And as a follow up, maybe as you work through some of these digital transformation, if we want to call them that, projects, what are some of the bottlenecks, right? Because at least for me personally, early on, I would say that I was very focused on the technical side, but I do realize that it doesn't always come down to technology, right? And you've mentioned maybe it is the salesmanship to the C-suite level, maybe it's the partners that you need to implement some of this work, right? Obviously, different systems integrators are going to have different capabilities. Maybe it's on the back end to do some of the change management. So I'm curious, like, why do you see our industry making such small changes in the space, and what could the bottlenecks be besides just the technical side?
Um, uh, I guess, selling is always one of those things. You can definitely develop a better technical solution. You can talk to people, you can read a lot of articles, but the amount of getting it to perfect can cost way too much. So, if you could flip a bit and get one more data point, and that's the one critical data point, or redo the whole system and get all the data points you want, obviously they're going to look at the $10,000 get one more data point versus the $1 million redo the whole thing. And so I think that being able to sell, understand what it actually means to the business, I think it's been a huge benefit for me. But I think the closer you can get to understand how big the technical solution needs to be to get close to good or closer to good, and the benefit the business will see from that, return on investment goes a long way, all the way up the chain, when you're looking at financially justifying or even eventually replacing the system. But the continual little projects that are closer to what the business needs right at the moment, and understanding that and being able to write the proposals, sell the idea, sell the solution. The technical piece is always going to be there, so that this thing that was supposed to take a week doesn't take 6 months and completely blow out the return on investment by adding one data piece. But I think that's a skill that you might not want as you might not see as much out there, but you have to understand how your projects, what you do, is actually helping or benefiting the business, and that goes a long way to getting that money provisioned, and people seeing it a lot quicker, cheaper, and right away. So yeah.
Very interesting, right? Like I said, my thoughts on that side is that the change management component is a very heavy, I would say, like uplift, but obviously securing the capital to run those projects is also quite a challenge. But like I said, I feel that our industry, and again, you can obviously it's probably different in every vertical, but it seems that there is capital to be allocated. There's just not enough people that at this point know the industry well enough to execute on some of the projects. And that's why you hear a lot of projects to an extent failing, and then it's another group that gets brought in to solve and salvage what's being left. And I think with the complexity on the technical side increasing, it's just getting it's interesting, right? At least from what I'm seeing. But I'm curious, maybe what Dave has to say on that side.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think both of you bring up really good points, right? We've certainly talked about change management. I have joked with Vlad, and I've certainly joked with our guests, that I feel like there are some months where our theme is just change management and how difficult change management is, but why in-house is so important change management is. From my perspective of talking to lots of groups on the engineering side and talking to lots of executive C-level groups, it is sadly not all that common that the executive C-level groups have decided that, yes, this is a project. This is the direction that our organization needs to go in order to allocate all of the capital that is needed. And then also having either an internal or an external group that can go about delivering the technical solutions and going and providing the change management. So I think it is the Venn diagram, if you will, of all of the very difficult things. Now, if we had an executive group who was like, yes, we're going to go allocate X number of millions of dollars to go ahead and do this, and that group had an internal engineering team who could go develop and deploy this solution, and because of these two things, we have an organization that is nimble enough to go make those operational changes, those groups can be successful. But as we've talked about on AI solutions and otherwise, that's what, less than 5%. I feel like 5% might be really high. Maybe 1% of the organizations exist that have all of those. Now, can you have a C-level executive group that's willing to spend more to go bring out in an outside organization? Absolutely. Can you go through the longer, more expensive, slightly more painful change management in order to be successful in doing that? Absolutely. I think that probably brings us up to 5% of organizations, plus minus. It's just too many times we have disjointed executives versus what most of the time is some of these bottom-up technology implementations. And then at the very end of the majority of these, it's like, oh yes, now we have to go work with the humans who have to go through the process of actually changing all of their processes. And by the way, all of the convincing and selling it took to go convince the engineers that this is the solution, to convince the executives that this is the money. That was the easy part of the sell comparative to the folks who have been working here for 10 or 20 or 30 years. And they've always done it this way. And why would we change the way that we're doing it? So that in summation is it's very difficult, right? Like if it was easy, everyone would go deploy AI. If it was easy, everyone would go deploy tablets or sensors or any of these Industry 3, Industry 4.0 solutions to their facilities and be able to go have all of the data and information in their fingertips. Sadly, it's just one of those much more difficult solutions than technically exist. I do want to go talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and AI. Amos, what are you seeing? Have you utilized any AI that you feel is ready for prime time on the factory floor? What do your predictions look like? Where are you generally thinking as to the maturity of AI in the industrial space?
No, I haven't found a general solution that, you can just go pick one off, especially, the main ones and stuff out there. And I think a good portion of that is just really because you need either one focused on, a certain technology, certain standards, and once it actually does that, you need it for your specific business, right? A specific purpose that you're looking at doing a certain thing within your organization. So I think that, where AI is going, once you can get it closer to being trained off of the data and for the purpose that you really need, I think it'll be a lot better. There's a lot of things, and especially around programming, that helps, right? Like you can, hey, I need this type of function, I need this type of thing, or I need to learn more about this kind of thing, some general stuff, but very specific, things, and especially around the industrial space, you need to have the knowledge. It needs to know a lot more than they currently know right now, and they need to be trained a little bit closer to your specific purposes. So I've definitely tried some different things, but it's more of a check-in to see where it's at, and see how much closer it's getting to actually being ready to deploy, not having to worry about it as much, but not yet, not quite yet.
Yeah, it is a super interesting topic. I think like that every engineer has, again, and I said this before, has at least tried, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, kind of like the baseline LLMs. I know there's a lot of companies, including some of the ones that we'll see approve it in a couple of weeks, that are using AI to either, generally, I think there's a lot of success in, let's say, developing screens, right? Like doing some of the front end work of your web development comment. I think the back end for manufacturing and industrial automation is just very complex for a variety of reasons, right? And that's a whole other separate conversation. But I think our industry is just number one, very small compared to the general software, right? If you go on Stack Overflow, you don't have nearly as many posts talking about, Python or JavaScript development versus, building something in ladder logic or structured text. I think there's just not a lot of documentation. There's also very little, I would say, without a paywall released from the top, at least PLC and HMI vendors. So there's just not a general, I would say, like strong knowledge base on the AI side. But I guess, I don't know what your perspective is, Amos. I'm personally am trying things, trying to get better at, at the very least, at prompting, but also, there's always new like coding and software development tools. So I'm also trying a couple of things. I had released this very small app that I made to pull data from a PLC, and surprisingly, using Python libraries, it was very simple, right? To just say like, hey, I'm looking to pull all of this information from an Allen Bradley controller using OPC UA. Can you get something put together? And again, obviously not within the first prompt, but within a couple, it was showing me information streaming from the plant floor into like a simple local MySQLite database. So it's very interesting for sure. I do want to take a step back a little bit, and we should have probably moved this question to the front of the conversation, but I would like to get to know the EV industry or the automotive slash EV industry a little bit better, right? So I certainly have not done any extensive work in that space, but I do want to understand, especially for the listeners and the viewers who might not be familiar with the vertical, what kind of challenges, maybe constraints, both I would say in the business, but also on the technical sides that industry has. And just if you could paint us a picture from your experience of automotive and EV manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, EV, automotive's been around forever, but the EV part is definitely a newer industry. And, you're just seeing a ton of investment over the last 10 years, especially, and really across the globe. I think that's probably one of the biggest things is it's a newer industry. So you see a lot more newer technologies, greenfield installations, or just, a lot of different customers that are just trying it out to see if they can, do something with it. But I mean, the EV industry has a ton of investment, which is awesome to see. And especially all of the gains that we've seen over the last 5 years, especially, just the battery technology is that much better. I mean, seeing huge gains even over the last couple of years, and just a lot more adoption, across the globe. You can look at sales in the U.S. They've kind of flattened, but that doesn't mean that what you're doing is just for the U.S. I mean, it's definitely a global industry. It takes global suppliers all across, everywhere to even make it, those products. So it's definitely a globalization effort, and it's a global market on a lot of those technologies. So it's an awesome thing to see, what we're getting to. I think that it still has some hurdles to overcome. If nothing else, where we're seeing, supply or logistic wise, but also adoption wise. I think we need to have another breakthrough, and especially at the consumer layer, to really see that next bit of investment and people kind of adopting it for every day or whatever. I see a lot more in like heavy industries, big trucks, construction equipment, stuff that's a little bit more standard, buses and everything. And so because of that, you're seeing that's what's really driving a lot of the technology advancement and investment in those, is for larger capacity, more and more capacity, which by the time they get that figured out and what that looks for consumer, I'm hoping that you're going 1,000 miles and you're able to charge within a couple hours. And I think it might be a little ways out, but I mean, I think that's where they want to get, and it might need to get there for consumers to really like start wholeheartedly changing over. But I think we're seeing a lot more traction, and across the globe. So it's really awesome to see.
Gotcha. Let me ask you a follow up on that side. From a process standpoint, I guess the obvious statement is that instead of putting in a gas engine, right, or a diesel engine, you're putting in batteries. But from a process standpoint, I'm assuming there's different testing that needs to be done. There's different probably validation on the entire kind of like engine side, right, that you're putting into the EV. So maybe could you paint us, obviously within the constraints of what you can talk to, what does the process look like if you were on the shop floor trying to manufacture an EV vehicle versus a traditional one?
Well, I guess one thing that kind of surprised me, but just kind of kick it off, like you also a lot of times have to change how it interacts with the drivetrain, right? So,
Hmm.
that being one of those initial form fit function kind of thing. You can take the gas engine out and drop in a battery, but it needs to be able to work with that drivetrain, which is usually a little bit different. Hopefully it has some regeneration and everything. So there's huge drivetrain technologies, changing as
Okay.
well around the EV. But past that, a lot of times it's being able to manufacture the battery to be able to fit, right? Be able to
Mm.
retroactively fit a lot of these old things, changing compartments and everything, and their purpose. So that's probably a huge one to overcome, knowing how you're going to drop it into old stuff, but also keep enough leeway to expand the technology and really innovate on it. So it's not all just like dropping it into to older vehicles, or other form factors. So with around the EV industry, and especially around the battery manufacturing industry, you have some large players, and their form fit function is something that you have to take into account, because if they're going to try to change from one supplier to the next, you're going to need to be able to fit, be able to drop in a replacement pretty much, right along the same side. So, those are just some initial, things that you might not think about around the EV. You're going to be doing a lot of slight changes here and there. A lot of the technology for insulation and, kind of holding stuff and routing power is changing. So I think that's going to be a huge thing to be able to fit a lot of these things. But form fit function is huge, especially when a lot of the standards are determined a lot of times outside of the US, large manufacturers of batteries. So knowing where they're going is, trying to keep up with that is always an interesting one. But
Yeah, it's super interesting. It's
yeah.
I've read some of the early patents that Tesla had submitted for the changes they made to the batteries, and I'm assuming it is a massive industry, by today's standards. But obviously, there's an entire technical world, and I'm assuming there's a lot of like chemical production and manufacturing, and that entire process is very interesting. I'm sure if you see it and witness it in person. So, I
Yeah.
appreciate that walkthrough. Thank you.
Well, and the other thing about, and you had mentioned testing, was because a lot of the largest players are outside of the U.S. I mean, the U.S. usually has some of the strictest DOT, that kind of stuff, but that's not necessarily true. And especially over the last 5 years or so, a lot of the standards around like fire suppression and what they have to be able to go through have changed. So it's a constantly evolving what you're being testing, what
Mm.
standards, where you want to sell them. Are they going to have to meet EU standards? Are they going to have to meet China standards? So the multiple certification, the multiple different form factors, and the tests to be able to go through and maintain all of that and guarantee all that. Doing it in Alaska is a lot different than doing it over in Japan for sure. So
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of stuff
Yeah,
that's yeah.
I'm sure those regulations could be an entire episode, right? It's very similar. I guess I'm a bit more familiar with the robotics type of requirements in the industrial space, and that's also changing, with the humanoids and such. But I can only imagine that there's a lot that goes into validating EVs. But again, that's a whole other conversation. I feel I'm sure could be a different rabbit hole. Dave, what are your thoughts on that side before we move on to a different topic?
Absolutely. I think it's been really interesting the last, I don't know, 8 or so years. The market has moved worldwide, globally, substantially, in just a very short period of time, and the market continues to move. The market continues to move a lot. We're seeing lots of batteries go from like those circular batteries that most of us have seen or we own, rechargeable style, into like flat pack or envelope style. We're seeing lots of just architecture changing, on the electrical side. So most electrical vehicles are currently running at approximately 400 volts. We're seeing the next generations of EVs going to 800 volts of architecture. And the reason why that's important is because we can take in twice the we're going to remove resistance and all of those other things, but we can basically go charge twice as fast, and when we move from 400 volts to an 800 volt architecture. And so we're certainly seeing more and more adoption of those in the US, but also like the EVs that they've got over in Europe and the EVs that they've got over in China that we see pictures of. They're amazing. Will we ever get them here in the US? Absolutely not. But the world is moving in some particular directions, and agree with some of the earlier statements that Amos had said in regards to heavy industrial, heavy equipment. There is a group called, up in Canada, called Edison Motors. I don't remember if they're in BC, or if they're not in BC, but they're basically making a diesel generator, that runs in order to charge batteries for semi-trucks, semi-tractor trailers, style of equipments. And it's been really awesome to go watch those thoughts and that movement, probably in just the last 4 or 5 years, as to the direction, that they are going. Having said that, I feel like we could probably talk about EVs for, I don't know. Well, I mean, I could go talk about EVs for the rest of the year. Amos, any last thoughts or questions? Any last thoughts or comments when it comes to EVs that you want to go finish off with?
Well, I'm definitely excited for where it's going. I mean, the technology, man, seeing those cars and seeing the different things that are being integrated, and honestly, with AI and the self-driving, dude, I think we're close. I think by 2030, I think we'll have some awesome stuff that you'll look back and you're like, I can't imagine that it was ever going to get this far, but it is awesome seeing the technology grow and innovate. So yeah, a lot to look forward to.
Absolutely.
So, Amos, go ahead.
Go ahead, Vlad.
I was going to say, so Amos, we have some final questions for you as we close off the stream. And if anyone has extra questions live for Amos, as we bring those up, don't hesitate to put them in the comments. So the first one, which is one of Dave's favorite, which I also enjoy, predicting the future, right? So I think we talked a little bit on the EV side, but when it comes to maybe more industrial automation, data, manufacturing, what are your thoughts as to where sort of that segment of the industry is going in 3 to 5 years?
Well, I definitely think with renewables and EV and battery technology and that kind of stuff, you're going to start seeing industrial trying to take a lot of their power off the grid, and you're going to see a lot of different like edge devices that you don't have to worry about running power and that kind of too, that can hit Starlink and go to your data centers, right? So you're going to see all this data, Industry 4.0, take that next leap to being completely disconnected, still generating data, hit from anywhere, feeding into the general, main data center, and then AI, starting to churn through some of that stuff. So, I think with the technologies, with the battery technology in a lot of different places, like you'll be able to see something run for a year or two, and you don't have to run power to it, and that's going to decrease the cost of deployment. You're going to get data quicker, and you're going to see it hit from all the different disparate locations. So I think the data is only going to increase for that reason, because of AI growing so much and remote devices being able to be deployed. So yeah,
Gotcha. I like it. I'm curious to see again, as I mentioned earlier, the impact of AI and how it synthesizes some of that data. I have my own thoughts and maybe comments on that side, but I will save them for a different conversation. Let me ask you for a piece of career advice, right? And I would say that maybe position that a little bit in the sense that someone's looking to grow within our industry. I would say to those SCADA and MES layers, and ultimately get a bit more involved with the data side as opposed to maybe being closer to PLCs and sort of plant floor OT. What would you recommend they kind of learn, maybe implement? How would they proceed with building their career from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit earlier. Just being a hobbyist,
Yep.
being interested in this stuff. It's a lot easier to grow once you're in the industry. It might be hard to break in, but if you're interested in it, you're doing hobby stuff on the side. You're starting to see, the issues. You're trying out new technology. I think there's technology is changing so fast. You just have to play around with it. You have to go out there and try some of these things. Like I'm sure that was fun, Vlad, making your app to connect to the PLC. But I mean, yeah, like you said, you play around with it. You realize how easy some of those things are. What hurdles you can overcome, but also the cool things that you can do. And especially if you low on experience, or you want to try to jump industries, like starting to play with those technologies, and that's sometimes just as good as someone who was in it but didn't really get to do much. They were just instrumentation tech or something. But
Mhm.
on the side, you doing hobby stuff is, I think that's a huge benefit to getting excited about what you can do in your career and what you can do with these technologies.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Let me ask you about a book and or content recommendation.
Um, so yeah, there's a book that's called 2030, and it was written in 2020, so it's kind of interesting reading it now. But it really talks about a lot of like macroeconomic kind of things that are happening, and how those things really do shape where industries are going. How robots and AI and healthcare, right, changing populations can really drive industries for more investment, for more efficiency, what some of the where you're going to be going, right? So there's definitely countries like Nigeria has is growing, population is growing a ton. I think, and we're going to see a lot of people coming from there, or we're going to be doing work there. We're going to see a lot more globalization around it. So the book was really interesting, and kind of pointing out macroeconomic trends that really shape industries and how those industries are going to evolve,
Mhm.
and things that you might not think about when you're just thinking about technology. Where the money's going to go.
Interesting. I will definitely have to take a look. Um, I think everyone's trying to figure that out, right? I think you've pretty much mentioned that throughout the episode. I think the changes are faster than ever, and everyone's trying to understand better, like where the not just our industry, right, but the world as a whole is going. So I am definitely curious what kind of predictions they do make in 2030. I appreciate that. Amos, last question for you is how can our listeners help? Where can they find you? What kind of maybe interests they should reach out with? Questions. Again, could be anything from you looking for other team members to you looking at opportunities or projects to discuss. Anything for our listeners.
Yeah, you can reach me on LinkedIn, and I did actually try it today. I typed in Amos Purdy, and I'm the only one on there. Shouldn't be too hard to find me. But really, I like I was saying, hobbyists try things on the side. I spin up a LLC on the side. I love talking about where these technologies are going, the issues that are that you're experiencing, or recommendations on connecting from plant floor clear up to web technologies to data centers to all of the stuff in between. I think that understanding where these things fit into the business, and the little little hurdles that everybody's overcoming. I love trying to figure out the solution, or just BSing about what you can do, what technologies are out there. If you haven't, hey, I've always done it this way. What else is out there? Can I try this? Yeah, I love trying out new solutions, or hearing other people's input on how they solve solutions. So for sure, give me a message.
Awesome. I think that there should be more communities like that for sure, especially for industrial automation professionals. Dave,
Sure.
final thoughts?
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with what you're saying, Amos. And thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, thank you so much for hanging out with us on this Wednesday afternoon. If this is your first manufacturing hub, this is a lot of what you can expect just about every Wednesday at 4 o'clock East Coast time. Come join us. Come say hi. If you guys have not connected to Amos, which I know most of you probably haven't, and you're watching on LinkedIn, please go ahead and click through to his profile and please go connect with him. Beyond that, if you're not following Manufacturing Hub or Vlad or myself, please go ahead and do so. We'll do our very best to go post updates and to get all of this content and information out to you guys every week. If you guys are watching on YouTube, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. I think we cracked 1,000 YouTube followers last year and have mostly ignored it last year, Vlad. This is Vlad's third largest it is no larger than Vlad's third largest YouTube channel. It's very possible he's got other YouTube channels floating around that 30 to 40,000 range that I am unaware of. I only know of 2. There's probably 4 or 5 others knowing you, Vlad. So please follow Manufacturing Hub and help move that up the internal ranks of most popular YouTube channels that Vlad is on. If you guys are in podcast format, you guys are awesome. Thank you so much. Please hit the like button and rate us 5 stars and follow along and auto download and all of those other things. When I remember to ask, you guys do, and more people listen to our podcast, which is pretty awesome. Until next week.